We'd like to begin this meeting, this joint meeting of the Provo Municipal Council and TMAC, our Transportation Mobility Advisory Committee. It is 11:07 a.m., Tuesday, November 14th. We're meeting here in the City Center Conference Room. And we'd like to call the meeting to order. Let's start with you, Mr. Again, or Mr. Strachan.
Cliff Strachan. Gary McGinn.
Dion Laurie Urquiaga.
David Harding.
Elizabeth Vanderwerfen.
Dave Graves.
Dave Sewell.
Dave Connect. Bill Pepperoni. Gary Wingerton.
Ben Morgan.
Kim Santiago.
Dave Decker.
Wayne Parker.
Thank you. The opening prayer will be provided by Jared Penrock and reports.
Our dear Father in heaven, we're grateful for the opportunity that we have to meet together in this work session. We're grateful for the roles that we have, and we ask that you please bless us at this time with that spirit, that we may be able to make the decisions that need to be made and that will best benefit the residents of Provo. We're grateful for the blessings we have. We're grateful for the food, and ask you to please bless it. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you. So we're in a little bit of an unusual situation right now in terms of our government, where Mayor Curtis has just resigned to fill his post as our congressional representative of the district. So for the next couple of weeks, I'll be serving as acting mayor for the state code. So I'm kind of wearing two hats, and because of that, I've asked my Vice Chair Dave Connect if he wouldn't mind conducting all of the meetings during this period of time where I'm wearing the second hat. So I'd like to turn the time over to him at this point.
Thank you. So today we have on our agenda a discussion on our Complete Streets policy. And the purpose of the discussion is to inform the council on a policy regarding complete streets. Complete streets is a concept related to streets for everyone. They're designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. We have scheduled to address this.
I'm going to introduce it for you. So, in essence, why this is on your agenda, TMAC has been working on a number of different things.
Austin.
Okay. Is this better? You can all see me more. So TMAC has been working on a number of different things. They keep a running list of ideas and concepts that they want to discuss on a regular basis, and when there's spots in the agendas that they can fill with those, they look to take those opportunities to discuss ways that the city can be more progressive about their thoughts on transportation and mobility. As part of that, one of the items that came up earlier this year, in January actually, was a discussion about what complete streets actually are. There is a misconception out there that the term complete street means some sort of standard street cross-section that includes vehicle lanes and bike paths and sidewalks, right? So there's this kind of vision of what that is. In January, TMAC was given a presentation about complete streets from a policy standpoint, and that complete streets is more than just a standard street cross-section, but it's identifying a policy and a way that the city directs transportation planning in general, and how the approach to street design and allocations of right-of-way space, how those decisions are made. So from that standpoint, TMAC has been working now for the last year. They're close, but not all the way through providing a recommendation that they would like to provide to you as council. And I'm going to let the TMAC members really talk about what that draft policy and recommendation is that they're working on. But just so you understand from that from the beginning standpoint, that's where it's stemming from, is they're looking at ways that the city can be more progressive in how we view transportation planning and street design in general.
Okay. I'm going to lead the discussion. Lori and Deanna are here, and they're significant contributors to this, so I want you to speak up a lot, okay? As is my normal practice, I'll make a couple of editorial comments to make everybody upset to start out with. No, we're thrilled to be here. This is really a good idea to get together every once in a while. We got a little less lead time and a little less info on desired agenda than we would have hoped for. Saito Sensei, who is now our chair, is tied up in a pretty important meeting this morning, so was unable to be here. So just remember that in the future, that TMAC does have a very active work list, a lot of things that are probably, most of which are of interest to you. And the other challenge that we have is we meet once a month for 90 minutes. So when you bite off something big, it takes a while to get it chewed, but we're working on that. Complete Streets, we think, is a important step for the city to have a vision and a policy that would be used internally and by developers to kind of know what we're doing. It's important to have a forward-thinking vision that looks out. We remind ourselves that when you make a change to a street, it's usually there for the next 30 to 50 years. So you don't get many chances to greatly change things. We've had a very lively discussion at most of our meetings during this year about this, and I'm going to make an acknowledgement to two key groups: the planners, who want the big vision, and the engineers, who want it to be practical enough that it can actually be implemented. And that tension has been very valuable, and we appreciate contributions for both of those. We have, as Austin mentioned, we have a Complete Streets document, our working document. It's not a book. It's 7 pages. We'd like to make it a little less than that, but we probably aren't going to be able to. But we want it to have the key elements in it that defines and spells out a vision and a policy that can be used internally by the city staff and by developers. And there's a lot of different ways to describe what I feel like we're doing, but certainly we recognize that not every street can be everything for everybody. But there needs to be, I'll call it, overlapping networks. We need enough bike trails that a bicyclist can get where they want to go safely, ditto pedestrians, and then of course cars coming in and out of neighborhoods, and then tracks, moving to the commercial and business parts of the city and back. There are a lot of examples. A lot of cities are doing the same thing, looking at, coming up with an overall policy. Again, a key point that I think is, we want to think of this as a bunch of overlapping networks that results in effective transportation for all, effective being efficient and safe and pleasant aesthetically for all users. I'm making a bit of a comment here. If we talk about the right-of-way, the part of any development or any neighborhood or any commercial area that's dedicated to stuff related to transportation is easily 25%, and often more than that, particularly if you consider parking. In a subdivision, it's typically about 25% of the area gets dedicated to streets and sidewalks, and the remainder being homes. So it is a material thing. Developers who make their money selling homes would like to see that shrink. And some of us who want to have a more beautiful and pleasing area, want to see that grow. So there's always a natural tension. And what we're trying to do is come up with a policy that will be an effective way that a developer can come forward with a proposal that he knows the parameters he's got to meet. Let me mention a couple of things that I think are important to note. There are a whole lot of national standards, and they include both how to do things and how to measure the results. And we're trying to, incorporate an adequate amount of those. We started working on accountability and came up with a long list of things that one could measure as accountable. And then we decided, okay, who's going to be responsible for pulling those numbers together and tracking them? And if all of TMAC can suddenly become full-time members, we might have time to do that. But it's a challenge. So we're trying to come up with a few key indicators around connectivity, around traffic flow, around aesthetics that can be looked at on a regular basis. Regular might be semi-annual or quarterly or even annually, or something that we can watch. Will also be effective for developers to kind of get a score on how they did, and it will hopefully create an environment where a developer said, okay, I need to do this well so that I get a smile next time I show up at the planning office to get things going. The thing that we're working on right now, I mentioned accountability, and that will be working forever, but also just the implementation, how you do this, how you roll out a plan, get it started. There's a lot of precedent-setting steps that have been taken already, and we're going to have to not say, all right, all history is right, we're now starting from here, but somehow evolve from that. I've said more than I intended to. I think it might be good now if we ask Dion and Boyd. They're both relatively recent additions to TMAC, not all that recent, but they've been here through this discussion this year. I'd like to hear some of their comments on it and then open up the discussion with the council and the staff folks. I somehow get a kick out of Bill and Dave sitting on opposite sides of that table. I know you didn't pick that, but it worked out. We want to have balance in this. Dion, you?
Yeah, well, I think you've done a great job. You haven't spoken too much. And you brought up a lot of things that if I were in your shoes, would probably have forgotten to say. But I think you've covered a lot of things that were concerns. And we're really excited that the city council is interested in moving forward on these two, at least knowing what is involved with complete streets, because I think that those who've kind of been reading and studying it for a while, we get excited and then we wonder, why isn't everybody, as excited as we are? But I think one of the things that really needs to be emphasized is that we're not saying that every street has to be, the same and has to, carry all the amenities that that can be had. And the idea of having context for a particular neighborhood or particular region of the city, and taking into consideration, how that's best used and what it needs to be used for, and how someone else who isn't accommodated in this particular place, how they could get around in other ways as well. And so, yeah, I think that's we really need to emphasize that. But taking into consideration the context is really important. So there's probably something else I'll think of later.
I already thought of one, but Lori, go ahead.
I would say that we spent most of our time talking about the vision of complete streets, and as Dion said, looking contextually and making it appropriate there, but making the streets an attractive, safe place for lots of different uses. We've got lots of vehicle-centered traffic options, but depending on the neighborhood, for bicycles or strollers or pedestrians, they're not necessarily the most comfortable places for people to be. And the idea with a complete street is that it's comfortable. Obviously, you can't go back and rebuild the entire city, but finding ways to implement this in a way that is a reasonable process for redevelopment, as well as giving guidelines to future development, is something we saw as being very important. And the aesthetic aspect of it, of having a streetscape, not just a road, was something that I think was pretty important to everybody on TMAC.
One of the things I meant to mention and forgot, and you two reminded me of this, is some of the early information that we got from experts that studied this thing is that how you design your transportation system within the city has a tremendous impact on health of the city. I'm talking about physical health. You know, allowing people to walk a little more is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Allowing more bicyclists, pedestrians, parents with kids in strollers, or that kind of thing. And so I don't think Provo's current situation is necessarily bad. There are areas that need to be improved as we redevelop and do some things. But there's opportunity, and certainly going forward, we want that to be integrated into what gets done. We expect every project to be held accountable to the complete streets. And now, if it's resurfacing a road, we're not going to expect every element to be incorporated into that. That's not practical, it's not affordable. But we don't want affordability to always stop us. We want to somehow push that enough that we get the performance. And we certainly want any major redevelopment area to really get thought of in a more up-to-date context from the complete streets perspective.
And one more thing that I should have said too is the street design can do a lot to I guess, ease the need, or not erase, but certainly lower the need for enforcement when a wide street is there, and then you say the speed limit is 10 miles an hour. No one's going to do that, right? But you can design the street so that the kind of behavior, whether it's drivers or even pedestrians or whatever, whether it's crossing the street, you can avoid jaywalking or speeding. There's a lot of things you can do in the design of a street that make things safer and so it'll be used the way it would be best for the city and for the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Comments, questions?
Well, a comment. I mean, you mentioned that not every street is going to be the same because they have a bicycle network and it's on certain streets only. But you would probably expect every street to have a sidewalk or a trail for pedestrians.
Yep. Directionally, yes.
Yeah. And that came up a couple of years ago when we were including a project. It was a road going through the subdivision that I don't believe it had any sidewalk or at least a dedicated sidewalk or a bikeway. So I don't know at what point do we actually incorporate these standards into development approvals, but you certainly would be advocating for that.
Yeah, the concept, this is hard because we're not ready to hand something to you that we'll call a recommendation. We recognize that when we do that, there'll be input and there'll be some more, discussion, adjustment. But one of the concepts is to have kind of a, you know how, what's it called? CRC? Where all the departments are represented to make sure everything in the development, you know, make sure we do have sewer. And that, we think it would probably make sense to constitute some kind of a complete streets committee that had internal city representation and perhaps some external, certainly some TMAC representation, something like that, to review projects and kind of hold them all to a hopefully somewhat common standard of, you know, this is what we expect. And again, the tension that comes from a developer who wants less sidewalks and a neighbor, most neighbors who want more sidewalks, that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's why we're in that implementation discussion now, and we're going to suggest something that we think will be reasonable. It'll be an addition. It's another major step in a project that we think will be required to get enough of a adoption of this kind of a policy and philosophy to make a difference.
So part of the project review.
Yeah.
What are the national standards or guidelines that you're looking at? I know NACTO guidelines are one source, but what are the other sources that you're looking at, and why did you decide on those sources? Or how did that come about?
Can you answer that, please? It's alphabet soup, and you did real good. You got one of them right, you know.
So one of the sections of their draft recommendation lists these standards that they see as being at least forward thinking and supporting the vision that they've established in their policy. Let's see, NACTO is one. Another one's ITE, which is Dave's helped me out.
Institute of Transportation.
I can never remember if it's international or institute, but so the Institute of Transportation Engineers has a walkable urban thoroughfares manual that they have various different design solutions and things like that they talk about for helping to increase walkability within an area and still provide the same engineering safety measures. UDOT has one for walkable areas, but there's basically this list that's through there. But the majority of them, at least the standards that are in the draft right now, that TMAC is recommending, don't focus necessarily on saying here's your solution, here's your silver bullet for every situation. It's more of a toolbox, if you will. NACTO is probably the one I'm most familiar with, and I will tell you it's a toolbox of they'll give you 5 to 10 different ways that you can implement a bike lane depending on what you're actually trying to achieve and how the network already works around it. So it's more about looking at those design manuals as giving us the opportunity rather than saying a complete street is a 12-foot travel lane, a 5-foot bike lane, a 8-foot shoulder, right?
So are these a fair sort of, are they coming from Dave Graves' department and planning? So coming from roads and planning and UDOT, is it sort of a equal sampling of all of those departments, what their desires would be? Or I guess that's what I'm wondering is everybody, all the departments, comfortable with using these guidelines as the starting point?
Well, I think that still needs a little bit of vetting, but the list itself came from TMAC. I can't remember which TMAC member brought it in, but they actually pulled it from another city's draft policy. And then that list was gone through at a preliminary level in a TMAC meeting, and I know engineering and planning were in there, and TMAC discussed it. But I think some of what would be good in this meeting is you have an understanding of where TMAC's going and what they're looking to do. I think we'd be interested in hearing what the council's feelings are on even pursuing a complete streets policy. Because do we want to spend that much time going through and reviewing those to come up with a really good, solid recommendation that everybody's comfortable with, if the idea about complete streets or division or direction that TMAC's heading right now is, if that's off in left field, let's see where we're at. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I personally like the vision and the direction. I just, I think you have to start with the right guidelines to begin with. And so just making sure that those guidelines make sense for the departments, make sense for where we want to go, as the city. I think that if you're drawing information, just making sure that whatever they are, whatever those guidelines or standards happen to be, that you're kind of starting off on the right foot is maybe my only suggestion.
There is actually a discussion around those standards that's also going on with the Planning Commission and engineering and planning right now as well, as part of, I think you'll actually probably see this today.
Yeah.
I think on your council agenda is the update to getting the engineering standards updated in your ordinance. Some of what Planning Commission has talked about is making that list a little bit longer and possibly including some of these. But again, that's a bigger discussion that's taking more time than the immediate need to see.
I think we have Mitsu Saito, who's a professor and is very plugged into the various standards and stuff like that. He brings a lot of interesting stuff. And then we have Dave Arnold, who professionally, worries about making devices that help safety on streets. And so they have a pretty rich network that they bring things in from. And then there's a lot of the rest of us that are just interested in things like this. So, but we have, and I tried to emphasize it, had, I think, constructive discussions to not try to get overly prescriptive. Our ideal state is that we kind of have a toolkit that we hand to the developer and say, we expect you to come back with creative ideas on how to get this kind of elements in your development, in what you're doing, redevelopment. I think we all click into the greenfield type development too quickly, and we really in Provo need to think more about the redevelopment, which is obviously happening in a lot of places, but we need to pay attention to that. So, yeah, we'd like to see the creative ideas come from the private side of development, but have a standard that we can check it against to make sure that they're meeting that criteria. So,
Great. I like this direction of pursuing this complete street policy. I was just curious, while this is being worked on, what are the guiding principles that we're operating on right now, or maybe another way of phrasing that is what will this policy replace?
good question. Dave, can I ask you to respond to that a little bit? Other Dave?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we really have, any document that we can put our hands around and say, this is what we're replacing. We have elements of complete streets that are part of our transportation master plan. Bicycle pedestrian, traffic calming, some of these other elements. We have, street cross sections that, are different in residential and commercial areas. And I think that's one of the things that is, we've had some of these discussions. It's been brought out that complete streets is more than just the footprint of the street. It's, has a lot of what's happening beyond that footprint as well as the value road. But I think probably right now, elements of the transportation master plan are probably the best thing that we have, that have some of these complete street elements in it. I think one of the things that, we've had some discussion about, we're not really sure, probably can get some direction from council on this. We're in the process right now with are selecting a consultant for our transportation master plan update. We're ready to issue a notice of award on that probably in the next few days. So we're right there on that doorstep. One of the things that we put in the proposal for that transportation master plan was a rewrite of the whole master plan, not just the code on what we currently have, but rewrite it to be more relevant to some of the other documents, our general plan, our Vision 2030, now 2040, implementing and incorporating complete streets and connectivity and some of those things. And so we're not really sure how far we want to go as far as having that consultant, do some of that legwork for us. We'll certainly be working closely with TMAC. Probably one of the first things we'll do is have them get ideas from TMAC for some of those things. But do we want, a separate policy that's, I don't know if it be in code, where that would be, and then address some of the implementation elements of that policy in our master plan, whether we want to have the policy issues incorporated into that master plan. I think those would be directions that would be helpful for us as we move forward, and probably TMAC as well as, should we be working on kind of two documents that correlate together on this issue.
It's a good question, because this is not replacing anything per se, but it's touching a whole lot of things. And we want it to make sense and have a pretty heavy vision element in it. Where are we trying to get to? You drive around town and there are some stark differences that were all good ideas when they were done. And, I think steps, for me, what the bicycle committee does and what they brought forward and suggested has been a little bit of an inspiration. Okay, they're trying to look at the big picture and fix gaps. And that's, what we generally think would be done here. But,
so help me understand, the vision of complete streets then will be developed basically through the master plan. Is that what I'm hearing? Because we have to have a master plan so that we understand how all these complete streets will work together. Or is there can I come to the city and say, all right, we got 50% of our streets are complete streets? That doesn't,
I don't think any of us feel comfortable with saying that this is a complete street. It's, it's the whole vision of and how that network works together. So, as far as the master plan putting together, we have the elements. We have the bicycle plan. We have a street network. We have, pedestrian.
we've allocated monies to help fix sidewalks, and we're paying attention to that.
Yeah, so, but that really isn't complete streets. That's an element of complete streets. It's more of this vision of, where do we want to be, and now how does, I think that document helps, work hand in hand with that vision of, okay, now how do we best implement what we want to achieve in our transportation system, which is made up of all of these different elements.
Including parking. So this is an ambitious step. That's what I said. It would be easy to become a book. We'd like to keep it at a fairly high level as a vision and some policy that then gets spread out. And I think the point Dave made, and it needs to be considered, is what we choose to have the consultant do in the, when I say we, it's the collective Provo, the consultant do in the update of the transportation plan. You know, do we want to touch it up, or do we want to really get down pretty deep and go through it and open up some, I don't know, new or different elements? You know, we've incorporated the bicycle plan into that, and now, you know, there are other steps, parking, including pedestrian, there are other things that we need to consider. And this is something I don't think any of us feel like we have a particularly clear vision of the answer, because you can't. I mean, we argue, Saito-san and I argue all the time about autonomous cars and the impact they'll have on public transportation in 30 years. And we'll probably both be dead then, so we can't finish the argument. But that kind of thing needs to be considered to some extent in a complete street type vision and policy.
So I can see the value of having a vision. And then you have to have a toolkit, ways to implement that vision. But I'm just wondering, once we establish both of those and have places where somebody like a developer can access the vision and the toolkit, when he comes in with this project, which person or department is going to then look at his product and see how it measures up to our standards? So who gets that job? That's my question.
That's a good question. That's why I was saying we've talked about having, again, I like to say it's an analog to the CRC. Am I saying that right? A complete streets committee that, and obviously, depending on the size of the project, the number of people that would be interested are there for the complete streets review, but we would want to have some kind of check to try to keep things fairly common across projects going on anywhere. And the kind of project, this is a greenfield development, a redevelopment, a restriping, resurfacing of street. We've got to at least do a little bit of a check and say, okay, have we thought about any opportunities here? We had a surprisingly interesting discussion about what to do with Fifth West going south. Did I say that right? I think I did. Because there you have the classic case of some people who are in there that have been there for a while and have got, they want street parking to continue to exist, but to be able to carry the vehicle traffic, but also the bicycle traffic that will connect to the trails that are now available on the new connector down on the hoops around the, what do we call it now? Lakeview Parkway. That required some compromise with things that have been a different way for a long time. And that, of course, takes some skillful negotiations. And, but ultimately, what's the benefit for the most people and what really fits the overall motif or philosophy that we're trying to create in our transportation networks and programs. That's just a recent example that kind of popped into mind that was very interesting. I left the TMAC meeting and went and drove up and down that street twice, looking at all the different things and see the issues.
So do you envision a committee, like design review committee, or a department?
I think it's
or a czar.
I don't think a czar. I think a committee, and I think there's more than one department needs to be represented. I mean, I don't want to. Clearly, engineering needs to be there. Clearly, development.
I think it might be something that city employees could give development maybe a score or a series of scores on how they fit with connectivity and pedestrian accessibility and other kinds of things. And then that would maybe go to a review committee, and it may be a committee that already exists that simply incorporates this into the evaluation. So it could be multi-level.
And the very good question, and the question that I think it's really asking is, do we believe the intrinsic value of a complete street philosophy, vision, and implementation is worth the effort? Because it is going to take some extra effort.
So several questions have been asked of the council. I'm trying to keep notes on all of them. Hopefully I can keep this straight. I am supportive of complete street policies, principles, and incorporating those into our code and our standards. One possible way to approach this may be to pass, have the council pass some complete street principles that we high level but feel good about, and give that to the consultant working on the transportation master plan. And so we're saying these are the things that the council has endorsed, and we want to see this in there, and then it gets integrated into the overall transportation master plan. I think the integration is the way to go. We may have a chapter or a section that talks about complete street principles, but I'd like to see those principles themselves integrated in with the rest of the plan. So it'd be highlighted somewhere, but I think it needs to be integrated. I think, just as it hits me, just as we talk about, committee, czar, department, or whatever, I think once we have those principles into our policies, into our standards, then I think that the current setup that we have with the CRC, I think would be sufficient. I think committees like TMAC and the council should weigh in on the policies and approve as they become standards. But I think the actual implementation of the standards can be handled with our current departments and with our current review process. And if we feel that the process isn't getting us what we want, isn't meeting the policies that we've established, then we can look at how that can be fixed. But I'm not. That would just be my recommendation. Let's see, what else? We've talked about networks, and let me just wholeheartedly agree that we're not talking about each street being complete. It's a network, it's a system. We need our system, our network, to be complete, and to serve all users. To me, that makes connectivity all the more important. If every street had to have the same cross section and be complete in and of itself, it wouldn't. I don't think that's the right way to go, but then connectivity wouldn't be as important. But if we're going to have certain, overlapping networks, then that connectivity is really important, not just for the time being, but going into the future, that we have flexibility to rearrange and restructure those networks. We need to have that connectivity. The discussion of development and redevelopment, I think both are extremely important. I'm looking at the current 5th West rebuild between Center and Bulldog. We have some specific questions right now that complete street principles touch on, and often it's a matter of prioritization. We do have wide streets, but still you can't fit everything into it, and so it's all of these things are good. It's just which are more better that we want to prioritize and fit in there, because it's always a trade-off. It's always a balance. We've got some redevelopment happening. I'm going to call it the Smith's RC Willie block. There's potential to reopen a street there that had been previously vacated. As we do that redevelopment, are we going to be vacating streets to accommodate that, or are we going to look for ways to maintain connectivity and even reestablish connectivity. But at the same time, as we've all discussed, it's easier to do it right the first time than to try to go back and fix it. And I'm looking at West Provo, where there's a whole lot happening right now because of the Lakeview Parkway. I said that right? That went in, and there's proposals coming in all over the place, and I think it's important to get it done right now, because we're not going to redevelop that for 50, 60, 70 years. So, you know, it's important. Both are important. Both need to be designed with complete street principles in mind. Looking at, and I don't have it with me, but it was Mr. Pepperoni passed out at the joint school board council meeting, kind of a map with current proposals that are in various states. And looking at that drove home to me, at least, that I think they're doing better at connectivity within the development, but I was sorely disappointed about connectivity between developments. And so I agree with the idea of saying, here's standards, here's principles, come back to us with you know, your ideas. I want to incorporate that, but at the same time, I also think that we need some broader view across the whole thing, and say this is how you must connect with the others, so that to get that broader network of
That's the kind of element that needs to be evaluated. That's probably come forward. How does it connect outside?
Yeah. Yeah. If you say here's 5 different street cross sections that you can choose from, and you know, a third of it needs to be with bike lanes or whatever, you know, they're all going to say, well, I'll develop this one, I'll let the next guy develop, you know, with the bike lanes or whatever. I think we actually have to have some higher level order established, and saying there right now we do have that with our connectors, no, our arterials that are out there. No, connectors. Anyway, we have a certain level of street level that's there, and so far they're all, you know, all of these plans are respecting that, but these are 600 address units wide, and if we don't have anything in between, then we're not going to be able to overlap that network. And so I feel fairly strongly, and I think what we can just look at it and we can say we're not getting, at least in my opinion, we're not getting what I think we should have as far as connectivity. So I think we need to plan and say these smaller roads need to be in there, and within that block you can do whatever you want, but we do need this. So you know, so this can be the one that's kind of dedicated more towards moving cars, and then this one over here is going to be dedicated more of a greenway for the other things. Right now we're not getting that, and so I do feel like we need to spend some time looking at things that are developing and giving it a little bit more structure, more of a framework for those developers to then build around and kind of put their own touch on.
Yes, yeah.
So when we mentioned what we were doing so far on this Complete Streets plan, was mentioned that we spent a lot of time on the vision, and that we really hadn't finished off or completed the part on implementation. So, you know, the idea of having committee, that's one of the things on the table. My own personal preference, I guess, is to go more like what Dave Hardy said, where using the infrastructure that we already have as far as how developments or how things go forward. It would be great if the vision of Complete Streets became so integrated into the current departments that are already evaluating developments that are coming on, whether they're redevelopment or whether they're, you know, green, what do you call it? Green space, green, new developments off of, you know, out of there. But if the concepts of Complete Streets kind of gets sent out into all the different groups that are already evaluating. Right now, I'm serving on both Planning Commission and on TMAC, and I think that one of the value of having that person is that we've got someone who's really watching transportation things, so that when things come through Planning Commission, then they're saying, okay, but how is that connectivity, or whether, complete streets becomes something that they're really watching out for. And hopefully in public works and in all, a lot of different areas in the city, there's a consciousness about what complete streets means for that, so that when there's new projects coming in, that's kind of the background. That's that when we say vision, it's an adopted vision. It's something that's integral into all those areas. I don't know that having another committee would be able to do it as well as if that was already in place. But that's maybe the harder thing to do, because then you have to go out and proselyte, the concepts of the vision as we've been talking about it.
I like that. If we need to get the word out there broadly. We need to educate the developers, but we, at the same time, we do well to educate neighborhood chairs. So when that developer comes to a meeting for the neighborhood, what's being presented is being reviewed already by what the neighborhood would like to see in the way of complete streets.
And I think the neighborhood plan comes into a lot, because if a neighborhood, got together, they said, we came up with a plan, and you also need to get some input on what complete streets means for that plan, so that when other things come in, developers or the city or whatever can't say, well, it's not on the plan, but we like it anyway, we're going to do this. I think in order to give the neighborhood the trust that their plan means something, it needs to be considered strongly. When something comes up that's going to either contradict it or tweak it some way.
Right. So building off what you had a couple minutes, I understand. So just to sum it up, in-house we have departments that are going to be reviewing the project from different perspectives. The Parks Department has their perspective, engineering, community development. And I was just wondering, Ben, do you think that a representative of the TMAC committee would have the time or interest to want to participate in any of the project reviews, so that you could see if what you're recommending is actually happening, or I
think that's a good idea, to include TMAC as a guest representative on some of the work. You're right, it's a bit of a problem to find someone that has the time to do that, but I think there is interest. We have some very good people.
even if you took turns, but it's kind of like when we do CDBG funds for the social services, people on that committee are asked to go and visit those social services. We see how the money's being used and what's happening on the ground.
Yeah.
One of the things that's in their draft right now, that it's in that implementation section that it's wildly a working document, but one of the TMAC members has put in some language that suggests basically that if the staff were reviewing, that there's reports that are generated. So at TMAC's regular meetings once a month, they could see these things of, hey, here's the handful of things that have come through recently. Here were the decisions that were made. So there would be a checks and balances. It's not quite them actually sitting on in those reviews, but that would be less demanding on their time too, and might achieve the same thing that you're getting at. Okay. But I'll make a note of that and help remind them.
I think it would create a positive feedback loop if you're involved in some level. Yeah. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. Are we taking a break right now? Okay, thank you very much for coming.
One final thought. I think that the transportation master plan would be the way to integrate that. It's kind of been talked about, like how do we get it to everyone. I think that's where it should be. The other thought is at a past one of these meetings, we were given a TMAC work list, and I loved seeing what was on that. I don't know if you guys have a current one, but I'd love to maybe take a peek at how that's coming. Excellent. But keep up the great work. We really do appreciate your dedication and the contribution it is to our community.
Thank you. Okay. Meeting adjourned.